Welcome to Psychologist Talks. Today's episode is the fifth in a series about borderline personality disorder, and this one's going to be all about gender. It's going to be a short one, too. I did look for other kind of social constructs, other intersections with BPD, borderline personality disorder, to talk about, but I couldn't find anything or come up with anything. And as much as I'm not a big, like and subscribe, put comments below guy when I'm doing these episodes, by all means, leave me a comment if you think there'd be an interesting domain to kind of look into, and I'll be happy to look into it and see if I maybe come up with an episode 6. But let's dive into gender. And I'm going to keep it simple. Again, I'm going to keep it brief. At the end of the day, it's going to follow actually very similarly what I've talked about with narcissism. My first series in personality was on narcissism. And if you recall, if you watched or listened to the narcissism episodes, incident rates are higher in men than women until we start looking at the general population, and I think most pointedly appreciating the subtypes, the differences that can presentation differences that can happen secondary to gender. And once we do that, we start seeing it as actually a little bit more 50-50. Well, spoiler alert, borderline personality disorder follows the same process, or follows the same sort of line of reasoning, where you look at the diagnostic manual, increased incident rates in women versus men, and yet when you start to go to the general population, what do you start to see? A greater equality when it comes to the percentage split. Kind of could be 50-50. And once again, gender components are a piece of this. So gender, much like personality, is a collision of nature and nurture. And, the nurture, the environmental component, is really massive. It's really massive because when we look at gender studies in general, just like what are the differences between men and women, we're increasingly seeing less differences. The more we study and the more precise we are in how we study gender differences, we are increasingly seeing the amount of similarities are absurdly way counterbalancing the scales against any differences. Hormones and chromosomes do matter, right? That does influence who we are. And so there still could be some inclinations towards, how people process emotions or express emotions, tendencies towards aggressive impulses. But again, it's not like a wild difference between these two when it comes to gender. And you better believe there's tons of crossover. And this is where we start very quickly heading into gender socialization. And what are boys socialized towards versus girls socialized towards or away from? Well, boys, and this is across many cultures, are more assertive, aggressive, active, more freedom and more liberty to go and explore and do various things with less social ramifications, whereas girls are socialized away from aggression. And away from more kind of impulsive, seeking, exploring oneself. Again, in general, we're getting better at this. Various countries are getting better at this. But then we've got a flip as well, where how are boys socialized around difficult, fearful, scary emotions? Often taught to suppress more. What are girls taught to do? Lean into those, express them, figure those sorts of things out, care a ton about relationships, talk about your relationship woes. And so you have this interesting process unfolding. And the ramifications, if we try to collide nature and nurture, could be that, men with BPD present with a little bit more, go back to my subtypes episode, I made it into the probably false dichotomy, but for simplicity's sake, they're a little bit more on the externalizing side. A little bit more, when the hostility and the behavior is a little bit more aggressive, a little bit more impulsive, a little bit more self-destructive. I think the research says higher incident rates of substance use in men with BPD. And there's actually some overlap with antisocial personality disorder with men with BPD. Now, some of this is straight up misdiagnosis, I think, where because we're so focused on the behavioral aggressive components, we overlook or we don't see or ask or they don't really express the more insecurities and the other key factors that would lend itself to a BPD diagnosis. And it should absolutely be BPD because empathy is still technically there. It's not pure antisociality, et cetera, et cetera. Do note that there could be cases of both too. Now, I'm not a believer in diagnose both. I think it's more just like, isn't it interesting when there's major antisocial features, but then there's still these highly chaotic relational components of BPD, and maybe they have features of both, or again, using the DSM, you diagnose both. So, we have to be careful of that. We have to be mindful of that. That maybe when we look at the subtypes, much like in the narcissism episode, women maybe are more on the covert side versus the overt malignant, which is where men are with narcissism. Perhaps we have kind of an interesting, opposite that's going on for men with BPD, which might be more externalizing. Actually, it's not the opposite. It's quite the same, a little bit more externalizing. But the women where there's less diagnostic issues are still externalizing, but not to the same degree. So we just have to keep that in mind. There's maybe a little bit more of a balance between the vacillations between internalizing and externalizing with women. Or, there's more fluidity there where men lean a little bit more on the externalizing side. Do note, though, I've seen, I've only been in practice for, licensed for 10 odd years. And in those 10 years, I've seen plenty of cases that reverse that. Absolutely. So whatever these differences are, they're just, think of them as like very general trends. And the only purpose of saying all of this is be sure you don't miss men with BPD. It is such a disservice to men with BPD to have that diagnosis missed, just like it's a massive disservice when women are struggling with narcissism to miss that diagnosis. And so let us be careful. Let us be mindful. Let us just note, okay, there could be this increased externalizing like behavior. And if I apply my own social biases as a provider, I might be inclined to push that more towards antisociality or narcissism rather than actually capturing and noticing the BPD that might be most prominent and most important for them to learn and address, because they might not. Antisocial treatment is not conducive for borderline personality disorder. And if you treat someone through a lens of narcissism, you're going to miss major components along the way. So let's be mindful of that. But again, remember, at the end of the day, I have met, in my mere 10 years of doing this work, I have met women who are highly externalizing who have BPD, just like I have met men that are highly internalizing who have BPD. So it's not a gold standard here. We're not talking like, let's create categories for men and women with BPD. Let's just notice the general trends and appreciate that while biology might be a piece of it, gender socialization is a massive, massive piece of it too. And I think I said this in the prior episodes. It's why I get so excitable and giddy when I think about what's the research going to show in 20 years or 50 years, or if we're still on this earth 100 years, because gender socialization changes, and it's changing even more rapidly now that we're more interconnected. And so I'm just excited to see, like, what are we going to learn as we keep studying personality and time continues on. So that's kind of it. The simplified version, are there major gender differences? No. Are there some gender differences? Yes. Do we need to anchor in those gender differences? No. Do we need to be careful because of that? Yes. Are we biased as human beings due to gender socialization? Yes, and we should be aware of that. It's a general MO. So I hope that's helpful. Hope it's, interesting. Trying to think if there's anything else really to add. I don't think there is. So if this is the final episode in the series, if you've listened or watched to all of them, I thank you for viewing this series. I hope the whole series has been interesting and thought-provoking. And as ever, stay curious.